Lucy Loses Step, we dive into the mailbag and address all kinds of questions about glaciers, airplanes, and carbon-14 dating of dinosaur bones, coming right up in this episode of Genesis Week. And a welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy, made possible by the supporters of CORE Ottawa, Citizens for Origins Research and Education, and now carried on the Christianima Network, christianima.com, Christian cinema at its finest. We provide some of the best pirate broadcasting anywhere, coming to you this week from the inside of the hyperbaric biosphere at Creation Evidence Museum. And if you are the first to tell us a note telling us the correct answer as to what they're building upstairs, we'll send you a free DVD. The Apostle Paul did not write about serving the Lord with all humility and mindlessness, but rather we believe God gave you an intelligently designed brain for a reason. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, you can just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com and you can find us. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get extras like Crevo Rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. The past couple of weeks, we have been backlogged on some stories. The first headline story this week is one of them. Some of you will remember previous discussion about the famous fossil skeleton known as Lucy. When first found, everything about Lucy screamed chimpanzee. Its size, the bones, everything. However, previous to this find, a fossil knee had been found 2.5 kilometers away and 70 meters deeper underground. Anatomist and forensic scientist Owen Lovejoy said,
"And I knew instantly that was a human knee."
So by Lovejoy's analysis, that means we now have a human knee joint found in 3.2 million year old rock, right? Now, of course, this is not what was interpreted from the fossil find. After all, humans hadn't evolved until around 150,000 years ago, silly. That fossil is clearly too old. It can't be human, because we don't find fossils from humans in rocks that old. And so started the chain of circular reasoning that led to the fiasco known as Lucy. The following year, Donald Johansson's team found multiple bones from the skeleton of an ape, alleged to be our ape-like ancestor that walked. Everything about the skeleton was chimp-like. Now, it only had one upper and lower leg bone from each side, but Johansson was convinced enough that the knee found 2.5 kilometers away matched those bones, so that he used the first knee to interpret the Lucy skeleton as walking upright. Now, the problem was, Lucy's hip matched that of a chimpanzee, rather than an upright walking human. But the hip had been busted into about 40 pieces, which left a convenient open door for reinterpretation. Lovejoy took some, shall we say, creative liberties with the hip.
But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp, but a lot like ours. Really? You don't say. Now think about this for a second. If a creationist did something like this to a fossil reconstruction, can you imagine what the anti-creationists could say? I can hear it already. Lies! Fraud! You broke the 9th commandment. You can imagine what the evolutionists would also say, and their criticism would be appropriate. So why is it that this evolutionist gets away with it? Lovejoy was a forensic scientist, a crime scene investigator. Can you imagine what would happen if he tried to pull off a stunt like this with evidence in a court of law?
Dr. Lovejoy, could you please tell the court where you found this evidence?
We found it buried below about 70 meters or 230 feet of undisturbed ground, roughly 2.5 kilometers away from the crime scene.
And how do you know this evidence has anything to do with the crime at hand?
Because it looks a lot like the evidence at the crime scene.
And you did what to the evidence you found at the crime scene itself?
Well, we know that the defendant is guilty, see? So even though the evidence didn't point to him being the culprit, we felt that we were quite justified in taking a Dremel to modify the evidence to fit what we already knew. So, as you can see, after we scientifically altered the evidence, you'll see that it matches exactly what we were looking for at the crime scene, which proves the defendant is guilty. I say again.
He'd be thrown out of court on his keister, only slightly faster than his alleged evidence. And yet this alleged evidence is presented to school children as proof of evolution, as you can see Johansen said himself in his book, Ancestors. When Owen brings a human pelvis, a chimp pelvis, and a cast of Lucy's pelvis into an elementary school classroom, the children have no trouble deciding which two look alike. Lucy's pelvis has a bowl shape like a human pelvis, but it is not as deep. You'll also notice that when you see reconstructions of Lucy in museums, they reconstruct her with human hands and human feet. Question: look carefully at the fossil evidence and tell me how you would determine what her hands and feet looked like. This isn't science, this is imagination. Yet, primarily because of a human knee, Lucy was interpreted to be an upright walking creature. So a few years later, when a trail of obviously human footprints was uncovered in Laetoli, Africa, and dated by the evolutionary speculation as 3.6 million years old, Johansen, of course, claimed this was further proof that Lucy walked upright. Wait a minute. We just found a human knee, as well as human footprints, in rocks dated by the evolutionists as 3.2 to 3.6 million years old. That must mean humans were around then, right? We have contended for years that Lucy was nothing more than a fossil chimpanzee who could not walk upright, and that the Laetoli footprints are from a human. So now, a new analysis of another baby fossil of Lucy's type, Australopithecus afarensis, has had further study performed on it. This fossil, nicknamed Dakika baby or Selam, had several foot bones that the adult Lucy skeleton did not, and had intact shoulder bones, which revealed that, surprise, the bones were just like those of apes who swung from the trees and didn't walk around like humans. All the actual evidence points to Lucy being nothing more than an ape, and humans being around since the beginning. Live Science carried a well-named article, "Who Didn't Have Sex with the Neanderthals?" Live Science contributor Charles Choi was referring to a paper that came out in the PLOS ONE journal where the researchers examined the genomes of North Africans and looked for signatures of Neanderthal in their DNA. Sure enough, they found some. Now, some of you longtime viewers will recall one of our first ever episodes, Big Fat White Neanderthal, where we examined research that showed Neanderthal DNA was rampant in almost all cultures around the world, including us white-skinned folk here in North America. Once again, the conclusion is pretty simple, and I'll emphasize it again. If we are finding Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, then obviously they bred with humans and had fertile offspring. Therefore, by definition, Neanderthals were human. There is no evolution going on here, but rather further proof that the words of Jesus were correct. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? The Bible is right about that. I wonder what else it is right about. Stay tuned, we'll be right back after a short break, and then we'll dive into the mailbag that's bursting at the seams.
Funny, fast, and furious. Ian's Crevo rants cover a multitude of topics in an easy-to-understand comical way. Complicated subjects that normally make your brain hurt a lot less when Ian explains them, while wearing his anti-government mind-reading equipment. Have questions about carbon-14 dating, natural selection, thermodynamics, or what on earth is he doing there? 3 volumes of rants on DVD. Take your pick for $15 each, plus shipping and handling, or order all 3 as a package and save yourself $10. Order online today at Ian's Bookstore.
Woohoo! Mail for me? Wow, did we ever get a lot of questions about the Lost Squadron and Carbon-14 and dinosaur bones. Several people doubled and tripled questions within one comment or email, so let me break them up. Excellent show, easy to understand, fact-filled, well-documented, and fast-paced for the modern soundbite generation. Brief bits like the chicken coop scene or the mailbag really break up the show and make it move. I got to see Glacier Girl at the Oshkosh EAA a few years ago, and at first I didn't even realize it was one of the planes that sunk in Greenland. The next day I got some photos of it. Also, can you tell me how many seasonal rings were above the P-38 and why the plane could not have sunk into a crevasse? Was the plane crash in the same place as where the ice cores were taken, or is the snowfall the same all over Greenland? If the ice layers in your photographs were 2 meters thick, then the cores must have been more than 10 meters across. Is that the normal size of ice cores? May I please see your sources on the frozen aircrafts? I would to see the report or any evidence of that plane story, since you do not cite everything you say or post it as a reference in your description. For those of you who missed that episode of Genesis Week, I was pointing to the Lost Squadron of World War II aircraft, which had to ditch on the Greenland Glacier in 1942. The group of B-17 and P-38 aircraft were found again in the late 80s, and one P-38 was recovered in 1992 from underneath over 250 feet of ice that had accumulated on top of the aircraft in 50 years. The P-38 that was recovered was named Glacier Girl. Now, a quick Google search for Glacier Girl or Lost Squadron reveals that there is no lack of reading and viewing material. The entire story was documented in the book The Lost Squadron and on a National Geographic DVD made for the History Channel called Hunt for the Lost Squadron. Or, for a measly $2 on iTunes, you can also download the Extreme Aircraft Recovery episode of Mega Movers. Now remember that the expedition was a historic one and not scientific. They were retrieving aircraft, not studying ice cores. There is no formal scientific write-up that I'm aware of, but the facts are clear, and you can view photographs and video for yourself and see the hundreds of ice layers visible in the gopher hole. So the point I was making was that this clearly shows that the assumptions of the ice layers, representing tens of thousands of years, is falsified. But let's answer the specific questions and then take things a step farther to drive the point home. The glacier and planes had drifted several miles from their original location, though the planes were found in the same configuration in which they had been left. We know that the planes could not have sunk into the ice or fallen into a crevasse, because in either case, the plane would be oriented differently. If you drop a plane in the air, it will fall nose down. It's the same principle in ice or water. Now, as for whether or not the snowfall was different at that location than where the Greenland ice cores were drilled, if you think about it, it's irrelevant. The assumption that an ice layer represents a year of accumulation has been clearly falsified. Now, obviously, this evidence hit a nerve, as some critics were so desperate to discredit what I said that they questioned whether or not the planes were actually buried under that deep of ice. Still, other YouTubers were again flinging around the L word, saying that other atheistic YouTubers had shown that I was lying about the ice cores. Yeah, we've seen just how reliable the YouTube critics are. When will you guys learn that trying to portray me as a liar discredits you far more than I. I mean, if you want to disagree or say that I'm wrong, well, then please do. But flinging around accusations of liar shows your own incredible presumption on so many levels. Now, let's examine the Greenland ice cores a little more deeply, complete with references, as usual, and see if I am lying or if this is another accusation hurled in desperation. For those of you who missed the previous show, the Greenland ice cores are samples taken from the huge glacier on Greenland, which is up to 10,000 feet thick. They get these samples by drilling a cylinder into the ice and then pulling out the core sample. Now, I'm not entirely sure how the one viewer was confused by the size of the cores. This may be because of my slide. I had one core shown vertically with the other shown horizontally. But nevertheless, you can see in this photo here that the cores are typically only a few inches across. The ice is composed of layers which were interpreted by various means to represent years, typically one layer per year. And the research team has claimed an alleged ice history of over 100,000 years, obviously a problem for the biblical timescale of 6,000 years. Now, as you can see by the photos from the excavations of the Lost Squadron, there were hundreds of layers that formed in 50 years. Layers of ice can be formed in multiple ways, sometimes in a single day. But there's more to the Greenland ice core interpretation than just counting the layers. The layers are interpreted using other methods such as oxygen isotope, volcanic dust, etc., based on the assumption of deep time. So the circularity begins to come around. They assume the layers represent tens to hundreds of thousands of years. They then interpret the layers as representing tens to hundreds of thousands of years. They then show this as proof of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Now, as far as volcanoes, there are typically 20 to 30 explosive volcanic eruptions per year. We only have a few hundred years of documented eruption history. So now you want to take volcanic ash in amongst the ice core layers, try to match the ash in a specific layer with a specific volcanic eruption when you have between 20 and 30,000 eruptions every 1,000 years? This is just plain not feasible, let alone reliable. Well, let's talk about oxygen isotope ratios. If you caught the What a Blast episode, we talked about isotopes. If we have an atom of oxygen, normally it has an atomic weight of 16. It has 8 neutrons and 8 protons. Then there are oxygen atoms with 8 protons and 9 neutrons, which is oxygen 17. Oxygen 18 has 8 protons and 10 neutrons. Oxygen 17 and 18 are isotopes of oxygen. Now, because oxygen 16 evaporates ever so slightly easier than the heavier isotopes, it takes more heat to evaporate the water with oxygen 18 in it. Thus, during the summer months, the snow and ice accumulation will, theoretically, have more oxygen 18 in it because there's more heat available. Thus, if you look in a layer, it's assumed you could measure this oxygen 16 to 18 ratio and identify the summer portion of the ice layer. But there's a problem there that's been known for decades. Those who believe in deep time believe it takes hundreds to thousands of years to compress snow and ice granules into solid ice. And during that whole time, these oxygen molecules can diffuse, move around. The longer it takes for the snow to compact, the more time there is to move around the oxygen 18. And thus, as Fred Hall wrote way back in 1989, eliminating any possibility of using the presence of such gases to count annual layers over thousands of years. But yet when we head on over to northern Siberia, at the same latitudes from which the Greenland ice cores were retrieved, we find the partial frozen carcasses of numerous animals like the mammoths. The mammoths alone were estimated to number in the millions in Siberia. And whenever we see modern reconstructions of mammoths, they're always portrayed as living in snowy, icy conditions, which is flat out impossible for multiple reasons. Using figures from the modern elephant, the mammoths probably needed upwards around 250 kilograms of food and 150 liters of water per day. Now, if they're munching snow for water, they have to melt that snow, which consumes body heat and energy, which they would have to make up for by eating more food. Where would they find all this required vegetation during snowy times? Consider that Siberia today gets down to minus 20 to minus 50 degrees Celsius each and every long winter. Now, the summer growing season really doesn't start until about mid-July. That coat of fur the mammoths have, they don't have oil glands that you and I have, and thus their hair would actually absorb water and further rob the mammoth of needed body heat. But it's not just the mammoths that are found there. There's horses, camels, rhinoceros, lions, leopards, bears, tigers, reindeer, the giant beaver, musk sheep, musk ox, donkeys, and a whack of other animals that nobody is claiming lived in Arctic conditions. In fact, Mike Ord spelled it out nicely with one sentence. The only similar diversity of animals is on the Serengeti of East Africa. There is every reason to conclude that the time these mammals lived in Siberia, it was considerably warmer than it is now. Please also note that the mammoths were found at the same latitudes and sometimes farther north than the Greenland ice cores. Allow me to pursue a rabbit trail for a moment to answer some other questions that were sent in. Ian, fossilized dinosaur bones are completely mineralized and don't have carbon in them, so what is the point of carbon dating them? Carbon dating only works on bones that have carbon in it. Dinosaur bones have been mineralized, which means the bone has no carbon in it. Any data you get from the testing will be inaccurate. Scientists have more than just carbon dating to rely on, which for some reason you do not tell your audience, and a blog is not a proper source. Well, first of all, apparently, Mr. Witz, you missed the previous week's show where I provided multiple references to technical journals and books regarding the excess carbon-14 in not only dinosaur bones, but a host of other biomatter from deep within the rock record. Last week, I provided Hugh Miller's website as corollary information. Secondly, apparently you folks are unaware that most dinosaur bones are permineralized, not petrified. In other words, the bone is still there, but coated with and permeated by minerals. Curie and Kappelhuis co-authored the book 101 Questions About Dinosaurs. Curie was the former curator of the Royal Tyrrell Museum and is current president of the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology, and even he said it in print. Bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil. Thirdly, let's say you're correct and there was no original bone left. How will you explain the coalified wood fragments from the dinosaur layers, which also had carbon-14 content similar to the dinosaur bones in the same layer? Fourthly, and this brings us back to the mammoths and the Greenland ice cores, notice that the carbon-14 dates on dinosaur bones came back with ages younger than the carbon-14 dates on the Neanderthal man skeletons. Brock Lee put together an excellent summary of the carbon dating on dinosaurs, humans, mammoths, etc. in his commentary here. Notice that Vartanian et al. Carbon-14 dated mammoth remains on Wrangel Island from 4,000 years ago to 7,400 years ago. Several mammoths are closer to the North Pole than the grip and end grip cores were, which have ice alleged to go back over 100,000 years. Now, wait a minute. Are you going to claim that 4,000 years ago it was so warm for thousands of years in the extreme north, so warm that it had diversity of animals similar to the Serengeti of East Africa, yet somehow the glacier at Greenland did not melt? Remember, I'm using the information provided by those who assume deep time. Using their numbers, it's pretty clear that Greenland would not have had an ice sheet at all a mere 4,000 years ago. And thus, the Greenland ice cores do not represent 100,000 years. So, to summarize it all, the evidence actually matches a recent ice age of the last 4,000 years, which fits in quite well with the biblical account. and the assumption that the Ice Age started shortly after the worldwide flood of Noah. Whereas, even force-fitting the evidence does not support the interpretation of deep time. You can read more about the ice core interpretations in several articles and papers here. Hey Ian, love your videos. I was recently confronted with ring species. Could you give me some help with that, please? I'll try to deal with this in more detail in a future show, as the question has come up quite a few times. In the meantime, may I suggest you head on over to the Ask John Mackay webpage, where he got asked that very same question. Hi Ian, great show as ever. I was disappointed to hear you repeat this mantra of "it is just a bird." You had plenty of good arguments already, besides it's simply not true. The feathered dinosaurs clearly had a lizard-like tail and feathers and arms with huge claws. Birds and lizards are very similar to begin with, so the result is an intermediate, exactly the kind of proof evolution needs. Thanks for writing in, and I hear what you're saying. I mean, I could be wrong about it being a bird, but so could the evolutionists. I'm saying it really doesn't matter. Similar things could be said about modern apes and humans. They are remarkably the same. But so what? They are still apes. Humans are still humans. We do not see apes building rocket ships and flying to the moon. The differences are far more than structural. But the evolutionary camp will interpret the similarity of structures in light of evolution. We would interpret it in light of a common designer. And notice my main point. It's interpretation within evolution, not evidence for evolution. Thanks to the so many people who wrote in, especially those of you who took the time to write in kind and complimentary comments. I wish I could read them all, but alas, we are out of time. I'm your host, Ian Juby. Thanks for joining me. I hope you'll join me again next Genesis Week. Next week's show will be a special edition on the age of the Earth, a provocative subject. I will be in Ottawa this weekend, along with Lawrence Tisdall, giving lectures at Bethel Pentecostal Church, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You can head on over to the events page on their website for more details. I'll be sharing some first-hand research on the profound evidence for Noah's flood on Saturday. Remember, you can send in your comments, questions to us in a number of ways. You can email us at comments@genesisweek.com, or you can send us a tweet at GenesisWeek, or you can head on over to genesisweek.com, which is our YouTube channel, find the latest show, and leave a comment there. Let us remember those words of warning from our Savior and Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." We'll see you next time.
We need your support to help keep this program on the air. You can help by making a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K2P4. You can also sign up for Ian's newsletter, detailing current research and news items at ianjuby.org.